Next.js Conf was just yesterday and I was there in person. And honestly, I witnessed one of the biggest updates we've seen in years. Next.js has completely rewritten how data fetching works because let's be honest, it was quite confusing for a while. We started off with get static props, get server-side props, which eventually evolved to built-in caching with fetch API. Then we disabled built-in caching in the later version. Then came server components and things got even more complex. But the good news here is, finally, I think they got it right. They introduced something called as cacheComponents, which simplifies the caching story inside of Next.js. And partial pre-rendering works hand in hand with cacheComponents. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how it all works with real-world examples of use cache, cache.life, cache tag, cacheComponents, and partial pre-rendering, and how partial pre-rendering stitches static and dynamic content together seamlessly. So before you upgrade your apps to Next.js 16, make sure to check out this video because you'll finally learn how to do caching right. So let's dive in. Now I'm putting together a Next.js 16 deep dive cheat sheet with all different code examples that we'll be covering in this specific video and more. So if you are interested, check the link in the description below. Now imagine you're building an e-commerce site. Every time someone visits a product page, your app makes multiple API calls to fetch the same data over and over again. That's going to be expensive and very slow, especially if you have thousands of users. So in this demo, we have two sections, a dog list component that makes 3 different API calls to fetch information about these dogs. And we're using a fun little API called as http.dog, which essentially returns a HTTP code along with a dog image. And we also have a product list component that fetches a list of products. There is no caching right now, so every request re-hits the API. For example, I'm going to clear this console right here. Let's see what happens. If I refresh the page, you will see that we get this log hi fetching products and hi fetching dogs. And the cache is in fact skipped for all these API calls. Now remember I said I made 3 different API calls for dogs and 1 API call for getting the list of products. So we now have cache skipped for 4 different requests. Now this can get really expensive if you have thousands of users trying to access these APIs. So now let's go ahead and turn on our cache components and let's see what performance benefits we get with caching. So first off, we are going to head to the next.config file. And over here, we are going to add another option called as cacheComponents equals true. As we do, now we have opted in to a cacheComponents feature. And once you enable this flag, your entire app opts into partial pre-rendering by default. Now let's take a look at the error that we get here. So if you take a look, we get this error saying uncached data was accessed outside of Suspense. We get this error 2 times. We get it for dog list right here, but we also get the same error for fetching the product as well. Now this happens because now everything runs dynamically by default. Next.js expects us to explicitly mark what should be cached after you enable the flag cacheComponents as true. So to fix this, we need to add the use cache directive in the page. For example, let's say we want the entire page to be cached. And as I do, now watch what happens when I refresh the page. The first time, the cache has been skipped. However, if I refresh it again, you're not now going to see the logs are in fact coming from the cache. And if you want to enable these logs such as cache skip or comes from the cache and so on, then you could just simply add logging fetches full URL true, which is going to give you these additional caching logs so you could easily debug use cache or caching in general in Next.js. Now here's the cool thing. We can put this use cache directive wherever we like. You can place them at the file, you could move this and place it over here, or you could add this in at the component level inside of dog list, or we could add this at the function level and so on. So we could move this directive wherever we like. For example, if we add this to the page level, it is going to pre-render the whole route with partial pre-rendering. If we add this at the component level, it caches just that piece, letting you mix static as well as dynamic keys. So before we dive deeper, let's take a look at what exactly use cache is. Use cache is a new approach, or cache components I should say, is a new approach for rendering and caching in Next.js that provides fine-grained control over what gets cached and when, while ensuring a great user experience through partial pre-rendering. With use cache, you get opted into partial pre-rendering by default. Fully static pages are going to load faster when they're going to be pre-rendered, but fully dynamic pages can still show fresh data, and that's what partial pre-rendering enables. Next.js by default is going to consider all routes as dynamic by default. So every single time we refresh the page, it's going to be dynamic. And the cache components implements partial pre-rendering pretty well. For example, over here, our navbar is static, but we have dynamic elements such as cart, we have dynamic elements such as recommended. So the server is going to spin up a static shell containing the cache component. This way we get faster initial load, and we also improve our core web vitals. But the dynamic sections are going to be streamed in, and we have to wrap them around suspense boundaries. So enough theory, let's dive deeper into this. So now at this point, if you take a look inside of page, we have added use cache at the top of the file, which means that dog list as well as product list are cached. However, that's not how real world works. In the real world, we are going to have a mix of both static as well as dynamic. So let's do this. Let's clear the console. And now let's not cache the entire page, but let's simply make product list dynamic. We want to refetch product list data every single time. In order for us to do this, we simply have to opt in to adding suspense boundary here and keep providing a fallback and then wrapping product list just like that. So now you can say loading products. Let's save this. Now I'm going to clear this now and let's refresh the page, and you will still see now that high fetching products and high fetching dogs still come from the cache. Now why is that? Let's refresh it one more time, or even let's press Command-Shift-R, which clears the cache completely. The cache is skipped now. Cache has been disabled, but if I refresh it again, it still comes from the cache despite adding suspense boundaries. And that's because with use cache being added to the top of the file, this entire page is pre-rendered. And even though we have the suspense boundary here, this gets overridden. So what we could do is, since we know that we only want to cache dog list, but still make product list dynamic, let's move use cache to dog list here. And we have two options. We could either just cache the component, or we could cache these fetch requests. Let's just go ahead and cache these fetch requests. And now you're going to see high fetching dogs in fact comes from the cache, which is what we want. And high fetching products are in fact dynamic. So if we refresh the page, you're going to see the suspense boundary that we just added loading products. But here's the thing. This is definitely going to be not so great for our core web vitals, because we are going to see cumulative layout shift, which is a important core web vital, because as I refresh the page, we show loading products text, and then the rest of the content appears. The size of the content is not the same, which is why it's not good for our core web vitals. So let's just go ahead and replace the suspense boundary fallback with a proper skeleton. And I have prepared a product list skeleton here, which we could easily just import. And now if we refresh the page, you're going to see a skeleton that just shows up right away. Again, if I refresh it again, you're going to see we get fetching dogs. But for this specific request, the cache has been entirely skipped, which is what we want. And now, since this specific product API, in fact, leans on this mock API endpoint, we could tweak how many products we want to show, and accordingly, this products API is dynamically going to fetch the data. So if I say I just want 7 products, if I refresh the page, now we are no longer fetching 12 products, we are in fact fetching 7 products, which is amazing. And what this pretty much unlocks is partial pre-rendering. We are now getting static as well as dynamic in one single route. Since product list is dynamic, we are wrapping them up in Suspense, so the static shell renders instantly while the dynamic content streams in. And by adding use cache instead of dog list fetch function here, fetch API here, we are telling Next.js to cache the result of this function. The first load calls the APIs, subsequent loads reuse cached output, and we already see that it's actually serving the cache data. Now, if you're enjoying this specific video, you're going to love my Modern Full Stack Next.js course. It is a comprehensive interactive course on building and deploying production-ready applications with modern best practices, like I'm showing you with cacheComponents right now. Now, this specific course has a pretty intense curriculum. We have 7 different modules, and each module lets you to build a modern production-ready application. So you are going to have 7 projects in your portfolio that you could show off. On top of that, you're going to learn Next.js as well as React in depth thanks to this specific course. So if you are interested, then definitely check out the link in the description below. I also support purchase power parity pricing, so you're going to see a banner at the top of the page where you could simply copy the code based on the country you are in, so that my course is accessible to the country that you are in. And for that, I'm actually using this app called as paritykit.com. I'm an affiliate and I love this specific app wherein you can automatically offer location-based discounts that will boost your global revenue. And it's honestly incredible because I've been able to get 30% more sales for Next.js course, and I keep getting them every single month because of this specific app. Plus, now my course is globally accessible because it does the math for me for what's a fair discount for your country. So definitely check it out if you want to provide global parity pricing for your product. Highly recommend. So now what if the product's data, we still want it to be dynamic. However, we don't want fresh data all the time because we know that the product's data is going to change, but it's probably going to change after a specific interval, not all the time. So what we could do is go back to page. We have the dynamic data for product lists. If we go to product list component here, we have this function called fetch products. If we take a look in here, we are literally making this API call, console logging in and returning the data. So what we could do is use another function from caching called as Cache.life. Cache.life function is used to set the cache lifetime of a function or component, and it should be used alongside the use cache directive and within the scope of the function or component. So for instance, by adding Cache.life, we are going to then say how long we want that specific data to be cached, or how long we want it to be dynamic, and so on. For Cache.life to work, we need to pass in these different cache profiles that we'll just get to. But first, let's just add Cache.life here from Next.cache, and then this is where we could pick different settings. Now, we are going to pick seconds here, and that's it. But in order for Cache.life to work, we need to also add use cache over here. Now again, you're going to see that the cache has been skipped, but if I refresh the page again, you're going to see initially the product's data was in fact fetched from the cache, but within seconds we were able to purge the cache, and then cache was skipped again for the product's API endpoint. If I refresh again, same thing. And if we don't want seconds, we wanted minutes, we could do that as well. Now let's clear this altogether. If I refresh the page, we are getting data from the cache. If I refresh it again, we're still getting data from the cache because now this cache life is minute. So we are saying we want this specific API call result to be cached for a specific period, but then delete the cache and refetch data after every few minutes. And Next.js provides us with different cache profiles that we could opt into. For example, seconds. This means this is useful for rapidly changing content. It's going to revalidate after every second, which is exactly what we saw. If it's minutes, it's actually going to be revalidated after every minute. So for content that updates frequently within an hour, that's exactly what we want. For hours, for content that updates daily but can be slightly stale. So this is, again, this could be a good option if you have products that maybe change their inventory every morning or something that you could definitely opt into. Days, weeks, or max. If you're not sure, you could always go for max here because this means it's for very stable content that rarely needs updating, but at some point you want them to update. So now, since minutes have passed, if I refresh the page, you are now going to see that the cache has been in fact skipped. But if I refetch again, you will see that it's in fact being fetched from the cache. Still fetched from the cache because we are still inside minute. They haven't passed that specific interval yet, which is exactly what Cache.life unlocks. So if you think about this, if you're thinking, well, isn't this what incremental static regeneration solved? Why not just add a second parameter inside of fetch called as next revalidate or something to pass in 60 seconds, and then after every 60 seconds we can revalidate the data? Well, yes, you are absolutely correct. This is very similar, except for now they are still keeping next revalidate properties and different properties here in the fetch API for cache components. However, eventually, I'm assuming in next 17 or so, it's probably gonna go away and use cache is going to be the default for everything. But for this version, they're keeping it backwards compatible. So yes, Cache.life is very similar to incremental static regeneration if you're thinking about that. So now we are still caching the dog list, but we are now caching the product list data every minute. So if I go to product list and fetch products here, Cache.life is set to minutes, but let's just change this to hours. Now, that means if you take a look, hover it, you're going to see what this entails and what this cache profile does. This means that the cache may be stale on clients for 5 minutes before checking with the server, and stale 5 minutes, revalidate 1 hour, and expiry of 1 day. So that's what exactly that unlocks. But let's say some products data changes in the API. Now we have 7 products here. If we go to mock API, let's generate 28 products. So now we are still showing 7 products, even though our API has in fact changed to 28 products. That means we're showing stale data. Now this is a decision you have to make with your application, how long the data can be stale. In this case, it's pretty significant. We have multiple products now, more products now. So having a cache life of 100 hours works 99% of the time, but now we have new data. So what do we do then? We don't want to redeploy our entire e-commerce site just for the cache to be purged. So we want to do something different here. So what we want to do here is we want to purge the cache. And for that, there is a function in Next.js called as Revalidate Tag. This specific function allows you to invalidate the cache data on demand for a specific cache tag. Now, that means we need to tag the cache and then we can purge the cache. A revalidate tag, if you're familiar with server actions and route handlers, we could easily call the same function in here as well, just like we would in server actions and route handlers and so on. So now, let's go ahead and tag the cache and then let's go ahead and purge the cache. So right now, we have Cache.life. Let's tag the cache to be products list over here. And let's make sure we remember this name. We are tagging this cache to be cache products list. Now, if we go back to product list component, we have this interactive button. If we click on it, it is a client component, which has this handler that invokes this function called as purge product details cache. So now if we dig into it, you're going to see it's a simple server action because it has a use server directive on top. Now inside here, we don't need to add use cache, but we could call revalidate tag that again comes from next cache. And here let's revalidate tag to be products list. Let's make sure that this is the same name of the tagged cache, which is products list. Let's copy this, let's make sure, and this is products list. Now this means that we have been able to tag the cache and now we can purge the cache with revalidate tag. But revalidate tag also takes in another parameter and we are going to call this max over here. Again, if you take a look with profile max, which is the recommended one, the tagged entry is marked as stale, and the next time a resource with that tag is visited, it will use stale while revalidate semantics. This means stale content is served while the fresh content is fetched in the background. But you could again pass in different profiles here, so on. Or you could use any of the profiles we saw in Cache.life. So now this button is the one. Remember, we have 28 products now. So I'm going to purge the cache. And you can see a post request was in fact sent. And now if I refresh the page, we do have 27 products. Cache was in fact skipped and we in fact got new products, which is amazing and exactly what we want. You can use this in scenarios where a mutation occurred. For example, new products were added to their inventory or through some form, new products got added, and inside that form, you could just revalidate tag. This way, this specific API, your website, can automatically show stale data the first time, but then the next time, it's going to get the fresh data and show it to the user. So that's the beauty of it, that you could easily cache the data, but on demand purge the data as well. So now to summarize, the use cache directive caches functions output. The first call hits the API. The rest reuse the cache. We have seen examples of caching the tag and then revalidating it, which means we can manually invalidate the data whenever the data changes. We also saw Cache.life, which means it's automatic revalidation like incremental static regeneration. And we wrapped our dynamic data around suspense boundaries, which allowed us smooth streaming. And this combination essentially replaced static set generation, incremental static regeneration, and server-side rendering as we knew them. But the benefit to all of this is that it reduced our API calls and improved our UX, and it saves server costs, which is incredible. So now let's do one more thing. Let's cache the component dog list entirely and not just the function fetch dog. Because again, this dog list component could easily be cached. We don't need to re-render the component whatsoever. So let's just add use cache to the component. If use cache sits on top of the page as we saw, the entire route became static. But the fact that now we have moved it into dog list component, only that component is cached. And this is how you can control which pieces are static versus dynamic. Now again, if I refresh the page, nothing is going to change because this entire component has been completely cached. And so are the products, because again, we have opted into dynamic caching but incremental static regeneration. Now, in case you're wondering, well, I don't want to keep remembering how the components need to be refetched after a specific interval. I just want to do that by default. Like, I want all my API calls across my entire app to be revalidated after specific intervals, or I want to just override what seconds mean, minutes mean, and so on. So what we could do here is go to the next.config file, and here we could tweak Cache.life, and we could tweak here what that means. And if we go back to our documentation, you can easily see what Cache.life does. So by default, we have these, but we could also configure custom cache profiles by adding them to Cache.life option in our next.config file. So over here, we could just say what stale means to us and a number, or what revalidate means to us, or what expiry means to us, and so on. So this is an example here, wherein if we copy this and paste it in here, you will now see that bi-weekly, the stale property is going to be 14 days, revalidate is going to be 1 day, and expiry is going to be 14 days. So this specific cache over here checks for updates daily and expires the cache after 14 days. You can then reference this profile throughout your application by its name. Since we called it bi-weekly, we can now go to product lists and go to fetch products here. Now we are going to have another profile here called as bi-weekly, and this means now these products are going to have their own custom profile. But we could also just simply override it. For example, let's say we don't want to define our own custom profiles, we just want to override what exists. Then in that case, we could just go here and then override it again by saying whenever it's days, we want to override the stale to be these values, for example. Or let's say I want 900, which means it's going to be 15 minutes, and so on. So for specific use cases, you can definitely set your own custom cache profile. So Next.js basically is giving us a lot of different options that you could configure your cache profiles with. You can configure based on your scenario. So you could pick and choose the exact caching strategy you want for your application. So essentially the world becomes your oyster. So thanks so much for checking out this video. I would love to know what are some questions you have about cache components. I would love to clarify them. And if you like the specific deep dive tutorial, then check out my video on the full Next.js 16 update overview, where I walk through exactly all the updates inside of Next.js 16, or my interview with Dan Abramow, where we discuss the future of server components, Next.js, and a lot of different topics that you may be interested in. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.